People think that detectives are trained to see horrific crimes, bodies, trauma, but it does affect you. The images will always stick with me. It was really hard for me. I'd never worked a homicide case.
Up over Lake Overholser, this was earlier today, where a body had been found.
Prior to this case, I never had to tell someone that one of their loved ones had died. It's just thinking about a needless loss of life, you know? Nobody deserves it. Let's take a break.
It's about right there, about where she was found.
There's a path that led right back to it, and I walked the path. But right where it hits the water, I walked over her. No idea. No idea. She was right there. That's the toughest for me.
An entry from MySpace dated November 10th, 2007. My baby girl, my hero. I lay awake in bed and worried about my daughter's future and that maybe someone could take that all away from her. I think about how when I saw that first ultrasound that I knew I would give my life for her at any moment. The world is violent and cruel, but maybe children are God's way of saying that life should go on. Maybe someday my daughter and her generation will help us all. Maybe, maybe. And you know what? Maybe isn't yes, and maybe isn't no. But sometimes maybe makes me smile, helps me sleep better at night. I miss you. Lauren was my firstborn. She was something. You can see the way her head's tilted like, oh. She's a good kid. I'm sorry we weren't there for you. Lauren wasn't a big talker of what she was doing in her life. She kept so much to herself. She left me a note. Said, I think you're probably gonna be mad, but I'm pregnant. She wasn't supposed to get pregnant. She's 20, she's young. She wanted me to know, but I think she was afraid I was gonna yell. That was scary for me. We argued. What in the world were you thinking? What, how are you gonna do this? But she was no doubt going to keep that baby, and that was fine. She was determined to have one. So Lauren didn't tell me right off who the father of the baby was. It took her a little while, and then she admitted it was Eric fan. I remembered him from when he came to the house the senior year. She didn't tell me that she was seeing him, but he just came to pick her up and he seemed nice when he came in the house. He was valedictorian, son of a deacon in the Catholic Church. She didn't seem that worried. She just knew that she was going to do it herself. She was ready to have a little girl.
Hey, honey. Are you headed out?
She had her hat with the pom-pom on it. Oh, it was hideous, but she loved it.
I'm just meeting up with a friend.
Had her winter coat on, and she told me she was going to a friend's house to spend the night. I don't want to call her secretive, but she'd say, I'm going out with my friends, but you don't really know who she's going with. I tried to give her space because she never gave us any grief about anything, never got in trouble. The last thing I said was, love you, and give her a kiss. That was the last time I saw her. When I texted her and she didn't answer, we waited a little bit longer because, 20 years old pregnant, she's sleeping.
Lauren, why haven't you answered my texts? I'm worried about you.
After a couple of hours, and the more angrier I got on my messages, like, call me.
This isn't funny anymore. You need to call me back now.
I think then I started going, this isn't just her blowing me off. She had had a blood clot in her leg. And they put her on a blood thinner, which was a injection that she would give herself in her abdomen every day. And I was so worried about that. I knew she would not have left her medicine. She knew she had to have that. That's when I thought, okay, something's wrong.
Kathy called me the next day, Saturday, asking if I knew where Lauren was because she didn't come home. Kathy definitely sounded worried, but in my mind, she's with Eric. She was seeing Eric from what I knew, not emotionally, just physical. Eric was purely fun.
I'm sure she's fine. You shouldn't worry about it. I'm sure she'll come home soon.
And I knew the complexity in her and Eric's relationship, that it was just sexual. Well, how do I tell her mom that? There was no way. So I was absolutely trying to protect her business. Lauren's gonna come up, her phone will come back on. Like, it will be fine. And, now looking back, that sounds horrible, but I didn't think twice about it. I wasn't thinking, the worst until we hit probably 48 hours. That's when everything shifted.
On November 25th, 2007, I'd received a radio call from one of the officers on patrol about coming to assist him in a possible missing person case at one of our local parks. Time was of the essence. We do have a young pregnant female. When I arrived at the location where Lauren's car was located, we did start trying to process the vehicle. We could see some of her personal belongings that were inside of the vehicle, and the vehicle was locked up, like she planned on coming back. We started talking to the immediate family members, and we asked who were her close friends. Was she supposed to be with anybody in particular? Eric Pham's a student at Southern Nazarene University, which is within a half mile of Eldon Line Park. He lived with his parents. And he also worked at a dental office. I started questioning him, and he said that he never met her that night. He denied ever coming to the park. He had been to an ATM, and he had been to the store. He was at work. We did find some receipts in his vehicle, and we asked him about certain places that he had gone. We ultimately got a picture of him at the ATM to confirm that it was him. We went to his employer and got his time card. His time card did show that he had clocked in that night when Lauren went missing. And then it showed, when he had clocked out, which was several hours afterwards. You would think people just generally get nervous when the police are questioning them. But he didn't seem nervous. He wasn't moving around. He wanted to help find Lauren. And so all we knew is she was missing. He was clean. He didn't have any criminal history at all. Maybe a couple of traffic tickets. In any type of case like this, a missing person case, the longer things go, the worse the outcomes we expect to be. We didn't know if she was endangered or she was going to have any type of medical condition from the pregnancy. We had to find her.
Tonight's search efforts for Lauren Barnes are intensifying.
At that point, it was on the news about the Bethany woman being missing. Like, this isn't a joke. It was 100% serious at that point. They were very pressured to me to give information.
Thanks for coming down here today, Vanessa.
Of course.
So I was all in. Like, what do you need? The course of action by Bethany police was, okay, A, B, C, D, E, give me a list of people. I was her inner circle, so I knew majority of the people that she hung out with.
I need you to write down every single one of Lauren's friends so we can track them down.
I probably went 700 different directions with social media. I let them down, this is how she knows this person. So they built up people to question. I just wanted answers.
We always try to talk to the last known person that any missing person talked to. Maybe this would have been the last person that she would have saw. We really got our sleeves rolled up and we went into overdrive. We went to Newcastle, Oklahoma, and located Matt. He knew Lauren. He knew Lauren was pregnant. He had told us that he never met her in person.
So tell me, what's your relationship to Lauren?
It's nothing, really. Just online. Text mostly, a couple phone calls here and there.
At that time, back in 2007, it was just kind of unheard of that the relationship was just from phone calls, from text messaging, and talking on MySpace. So that did raise some concerns with us. We asked him, where were you at during this time? What was going on? And he had told us he was with a friend, and he was at a local bar, and that he was involved in an accident that evening, and he had informed the police and filed a report.
You can check the time on the police report. I was nowhere near Lauren that night.
We were able to corroborate that information.
After 4 days of her not returning my phone calls, I kept thinking, okay, the phone's gonna ring. You know, you always think, okay, phone's gonna ring, she's gonna go, joke's on me.
Can you tell me about it?
I didn't sleep very well. I always was worried that she was hurt somewhere and needing help and we couldn't get to her. That's what kept me from sleeping. Was I just know she's cold somewhere and I don't know how to get to her. We don't know where she is. You know, you start feeling guilty. Not having any idea where she was. You know, she was needing help. You know, being hurt. Left for dead. Not supposed to be that way. I think I was losing hope. But I knew we had to find her.
Right now, many questions, but few answers for a desperate mother.
I mean, if there's any information, let us know. You know, today's my birthday. You know, make it a happy one. You walk with everybody else and you move leaves and you're looking for anything. When we were searching the Elben Lion Park, there were helicopters. And we could see the police cars blocking off the lake road down and around the bend.
Up over Lake Overholser, this was earlier today, where a body had been found.
Investigators tell us the woman appears to have died from a gunshot wound to the head.
We hurry up and got out, and I just needed to know. I mean, I was just frantic on, just tell me if that's my daughter or not.
We received information from Oklahoma City Police Department that they had located a deceased female at the lake. The lake that the body was discovered is 2 miles from Eldenline Park. We did believe that they had found Lauren. I remember seeing the deceased female, and I knew her height and weight and her characteristics that it wasn't her. It was an older female that they had located. And I knew at that point, that's not who we found. That wasn't Lauren. After I saw the deceased woman, I was relieved. And maybe that's bad to say, because somebody else just lost a loved one. But I was already vested in my investigation of Lauren. She was still out there and she still needed to be found.
When they finally told us, I was like, are you sure? Are you sure that's not her? It was a relief, but I knew now we're starting all over again and now we've got to look for her.
So you go back into hope and go through all those emotions again. It was early in the morning. I remember it was cold. I really wanted to go and focus on the task. They just kind of gave us things to look for. If you see anything, brush out of the way, or if you see this, they gave us like key things to look for. You move stuff around and you go more in a mode where you don't want to find the body. But you are there to do it. Like if you see brush over something, or if you see dirt spun up that shouldn't be there, kick it out of the way, walk down paths, look for any type of articles, and it's just like to search a place like that and to find, like, it's just kind of mind-blowing when you replay it back. But it's a very conflicted process. You're walking, you're kicking things aside. And when you think about it, you're searching for a body being dumped is what you were looking for. Like, okay, I don't want to find this body, but do I? But you can't be hopeless. I searched for a body that I didn't want to find. And we did it. It's insane.
We went to his employer, and one of the big things that we did learn is that there were no cameras where he worked. So he could take his time card, punch it, put it back in its slot, and then just walk out. And he could go anywhere at that time. At that point, we were trying to make the ties. We just didn't have good, concrete, tangible evidence at that point. We had spoken with some of Lauren's other friends who gave us information that Lauren had basically confronted Eric's fiance about her being pregnant and 5 months pregnant, and that Eric was the baby's father. I think she was expecting us to come at one point or another, but I don't think she expected us to get there that soon to question her.
And where were you the night of November 23rd?
We were just asking general questions for the most part. His fiancée didn't even know that he was still seeing Lauren.
No, he had no reason to want to see her.
She was in denial, and she had told us his parents didn't know that Lauren was pregnant.
Just for the sake of the argument, if Eric is this baby's father...
If he is, well, his parents will kill him. I can tell you that.
The fact that, his parents didn't know that Lauren was pregnant, his fiancée didn't know. He did have things to hide. She started providing information for us to establish a motive, if in fact Eric was involved. What was interesting is while we were talking to her, Eric pulled up in his vehicle and saw officers there. He just left. Being an investigator, your head starts to go and go full speed. We had detectives and officers going throughout the city trying to locate Eric. That's when I received a call from another officer at the police department. David, Eric's best friend, it just came in and gave a full confession of what Eric had told him on the previous evening. So we were gonna locate Eric no matter what at that point. On November 28th, 2007, David, Eric's best friend, came to the police department.
Are you David?
Yeah.
Thanks for coming in.
He had told us that on the 27th, he had received a call from Eric about wanting to meet up and talk.
He said he wanted to talk in person, so he was gonna come over to my place.
David was telling him, hey, did you see the news broadcast? They're looking for Lauren. And then as he started watching the news broadcasts, that's when he really, took a turn for the south, so to speak.
It's turning to the bad side. Let's don't sugarcoat it.
Today, hundreds have come forward to search for Lauren Barnes, spreading across the area and looking for any potential clues.
He said Eric got visibly sick, like he wanted to throw up. And that's when he confessed to his friend. He believed that he painted himself in a corner, so to speak. He was living a lie, he was cheating. I think, with his parents, he didn't want to embarrass them any longer.
More than 100 people volunteered to search.
Ultimately, I told him that he met Lauren at Eldenline Park and strangled her and dropped her body off in the Stinchcombe area, which is within a half mile of Eldenline Park. He had killed Lauren. I received a phone call from another officer telling me that David had called him and gave him a location where Eric may be. He was probably going to be at his attorney's office. So we set up surveillance on the location.
I Got eyes on the suspect.
And sure enough, within a few minutes, Eric pulls up. He gave up. He knew at that point. We all did.
Eric Fawn, the man police believe killed a pregnant woman, is in the Oklahoma County Jail tonight.
Police say he was docile and quiet. They were hoping he would talk.
I received a phone call from the district attorney providing me information on where to look. Basically, a map, so to speak. I didn't know what to expect. I had no idea what I was walking into. It's cold outside. Everybody was just kind of quiet. When we got to the location, you could see that the ground had been disturbed. It had sticks and tree branches on top of it. One of the first things I remember seeing was just skin. You couldn't identify her. And as they were removing the dirt from her, you could see, parts of her arm, maybe an elbow, a knee. More and more of her just started to come into view. And it wasn't until I saw her tattoo, and at that point we knew. It was really hard for me. I'd never worked a homicide case. Prior to this case, it's just thinking about a needless loss of life, Nobody deserves it. Let's take a break.
There is no searching.
It's the toughest for me.
During court, Eric was there in custody. He had handcuffs on him. In my mind, I went in thinking I'm gonna hear they got into an altercation, a fight. This is a passion-heated type crime. But I find out that that is not at all what happened. Eric was someone that we all respected. I mean, at school, he was the president of the student body. It's such a mind-blowing emotion to this day. I still can't process it. He comes from culture and a heritage that he has to be successful and take care of his family. It was that simple, but that complex for him. He had to be somebody, and Lauren was an issue for him. That was it for his family. He did not want to disappoint them. He had to be successful, and having a child was not going to give him that life. He was engaged, and there's a baby out of wedlock. He didn't want the baby. She didn't want an abortion. He had said that they met up to talk and that he basically turned her around. And she's like, Eric, don't. I'll get an abortion. He choked her to the point where she went limp. And then took her body and drug her down the path to the hole he dug and threw dirt over her while she was breathing. Just like that. And there was no acknowledgement ever of the baby. I don't think he cared. He wanted to take care of it by taking care of it. I got physically sick. I had to leave the courtroom.
I was hoping that I would hear that it was fast, and it wasn't. You don't want your child to suffer, and she did. That's like the slowest method of death. Just to strangle someone. What I remember is, after all of it, I remember thinking I was sleeping while this was all going on. So it sort of makes me mad. I mean, 5 months pregnant with your baby and you kill them. I just don't get that. The messages back and forth on her computer, her and Eric's computer the night that she left. Eric, well, what do you got planned for tonight? Do you want to meet me at the park? I want to tell you what I'm planning on doing with us. Don't worry, it's good. And Lauren says, you're not going to kill me, are you? And then she goes, I'm kidding. And he says, I just want to see you and tell you to your little cute face. And Lauren says, oh, God, you are going to kill me. When I first read this, I went, oh, my God. He dug the grave the day before. He had it planned. I mean, you know that now, but, you know.
After the case, after the reports were written, after you had time to sit and reflect about things, The images will always stick with me. Maybe she knew in the back of her head that something may happen, but I think she was trying to maybe reconcile with him and be a part of the baby's life, have him, be the father. You feel the heartache. She was excited to be a mom. You can't tell a killer by looking at him. You just never know what's going to put someone over the edge.
Oh, God. I mean, looking back at it, it's just a void that will never be filled. I mean, you miss out on talking to her and just being friends. I'm still emotional about it. I still think about it. That's what he took away. I mean, he took away from himself, too. And it would have been okay, like, he could have led his life. That was the biggest thing. She didn't want anything, and even if she did or whatever he was thinking. And he took her away. I mean, he took her away and he took a piece of me,
Messed with me pretty good. I won't forget, won't forgive. I'll probably still be angry until I get that phone call that says he's dead. Saw that first ultrasound that I knew I would give my life for her at any moment. The world is violent and cruel, but maybe children are God's way of saying that life should go on. Maybe someday my daughter and her generation.
A cold wind howls through the concrete canyons of Boston, carrying with it the scent of old rain and forgotten secrets as the city sleeps under a heavy blanket of autumn mist. It was November 1994 when the darkness swallowed her whole, a routine evening that dissolved into a waking nightmare, leaving behind an echo that would haunt these streets for over 3 decades. The neon lights of the diner flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement where her car sat abandoned, its driver's side door slightly ajar, a half-empty paper cup of coffee still warm in the console. She was there, and then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone, erased from the face of the earth without a struggle, without a scream, without a single witness to point a finger into the void. Police sirens wailed through the midnight air, cutting through the silence of a community that would never feel safe again, as investigators flooded the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the gloom but finding absolutely nothing. It was the birth of the ultimate Boston cold case, a modern urban legend wrapped in horror, a terrifying puzzle that defied every tool of 20th century forensics and left a family shattered in the dark. For 32 years, that empty coffee cup sat in a cardboard evidence box, a silent monument to failure, while a killer walked the very same streets, breathing the free air, blending into the crowd, entirely convinced he had committed the perfect crime. But time is a fickle beast, and justice has a way of hiding in the microscopic code of human life, waiting for the world to catch up with the horror of that forgotten November night. Tonight, the silence is finally broken, the ancient dust is kicked up, and the terrifying truth emerges from a single, discarded paper cup that turned a ghost story into a hunt for a monster. The neighborhood of South Boston in 1994 was a tight-knit labyrinth of brick row houses, local taverns, and unspoken rules, a place where people knew their neighbors, but also knew when to look the other way. When 22-year-old nursing student Elena Vance vanished on her way home from a late-shift clinical rotation, the neighborhood's tight-knit fabric tore apart at the seams overnight. She was the definition of promise, a bright light in a gritty city, working double shifts to build a life, loved by her patients, adored by her family, completely detached from the criminal underbelly of the city. Her walk from the subway station to her apartment was barely 3 blocks, a route she had taken hundreds of times under the watchful eyes of the neighborhood storefronts and familiar street lamps. Yet, on that specific Tuesday at exactly 11:14 p.m., the timeline fractured, her footsteps stopped echoing, and the space she occupied became a vacuum of terror and unanswered questions. The initial frantic search by her brother and father yielded only her vehicle, parked haphazardly near an alleyway, keys still in the ignition, her purse untouched on the passenger seat, signaling a sudden, violent interruption. Detectives who arrived on the scene noted the eerie lack of physical struggle. There were no scuff marks on the asphalt, no torn clothing, no drops of blood to indicate a desperate fight for survival. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the freezing New England air, leaving behind only the chilling warmth of a freshly poured coffee that she never got to finish. As the dawn broke over a stunned city, the reality of Elena's disappearance escalated from a missing person report into a full-scale homicide investigation, despite the glaring absence of a body. The local media seized upon the story, flashing her smiling graduation portrait across every television screen in New England, contrasting her innocent gaze against the grim reality of the bleak Boston winter. Hundreds of volunteers combed through nearby parks, abandoned warehouses, and the freezing shorelines of the harbor, their hands numbed by the cold, their hearts heavy with a growing sense of dread. Every tip that flooded the hotline led to a dead end. Every suspected vehicle turned out to be a false alarm. Every shadow in the alleyway remained just a shadow. The police department deployed their best bloodhounds, but the dogs lost her scent exactly where the car was found, suggesting she had been forced into another vehicle against her will. The lack of security cameras in 1994 meant investigators were flying blind, relying on human eyes and ears in a neighborhood suddenly paralyzed by fear and suspicion. Paranoia gripped the community as rumors spread that the predator was someone local, someone who knew her routine, someone who was watching from the window as the flashing blue lights illuminated the crime scene. Weeks bled into grueling months, and the frenzied energy of the initial investigation slowly began to cool into the agonizing stagnation of a frozen file. Detectives interviewed ex-boyfriends, co-workers, strangers who frequented the diner, and even transit workers. But everyone had an alibi, and no one possessed a motive to harm a young woman who had no enemies. The physical evidence collected from her vehicle was painfully scarce. A few stray fibers that could have come from anyone, fingerprints belonging solely to Elena and her family, and that haunting paper coffee cup. Forensics at the time could only check for standard blood types and basic latent prints on the cup's plastic lid, both of which yielded nothing useful to the primitive databases of the mid-90s. The case file grew thick with useless paperwork, dead-end leads, and heartbreaking letters from Elena's mother, who refused to change the locks on her front door, praying every night for a daughter who would never return. The leads dried up completely by the summer of 1995, and the detectives assigned to the case were reassigned to newer, fresher tragedies, leaving Elena's file to be boxed up, labeled, and buried in the basement archives of police headquarters. For over 3 decades, the Vance case remained a open wound in the heart of Boston, a dark chapter that defined a generation of detectives who hated leaving a job unfinished. Generation after generation of cold case investigators would occasionally pull the dusty box from the shelves, flipping through the faded Polaroid photographs of the alleyway, staring at the smiling face of Elena Vance, wondering what they were missing. The world outside changed dramatically. Technology leaped forward. DNA profiling evolved from a rare laboratory novelty into a precise science, capable of identifying a killer from an invisible speck of skin cells. Yet, the evidence from 1994 remained locked away in stasis, preserved in a climate-controlled room, a ticking time bomb of genetic data waiting for the right moment, the right technique, and the right investigator to unlock its secrets. Elena's parents passed away without ever knowing what happened to their daughter, their hearts broken by 30 years of unanswered questions, leaving only her younger brother, Michael, to carry the torch of justice into a new millennium. Michael never stopped calling the precinct, never stopped reminding the city that his sister's life mattered, refusing to let her memory be completely erased by the relentless march of time. The breakthrough did not come from a dramatic confession or a sudden tip, but from the quiet, meticulous work of a new generation of forensic scientists utilizing cutting-edge genetic genealogy. In early 2026, a specialized cold case unit decided to re-examine the physical evidence from the 1994 scene, applying advanced DNA extraction techniques to items previously deemed unviable for testing. Their focus turned toward the rim of that preserved paper coffee cup and its plastic lid, betting on the theory that the perpetrator might have handled it during the abduction or left behind microscopic traces of saliva or sweat. Using ultra-sensitive vacuum-assisted collection methods, scientists managed to isolate a partial male DNA profile that did not belong to Elena, her family, or any of the original first responders. This genetic fingerprint was uploaded into CODIS, the National Offender Database, but the system returned a frustrating result: no match found, meaning the killer had managed to avoid a felony conviction that would require his DNA to be registered. Refusing to accept defeat, the team partnered with a private forensic genomics lab, uploading the profile into public investigative genetic genealogy databases to build a massive, complex family tree of the unknown suspect. The genealogical web spun by the scientists began to narrow down, tracing the anonymous DNA back through generations of New England families, eventually focusing on a specific bloodline with deep roots in Boston. The tree pointed directly toward 3 brothers who were living in the metropolitan area in 1994, each of whom had to be systematically investigated, tracked, and eliminated by modern surveillance teams. 2 of the brothers had ironclad alibis or were completely out of the state during the month of Elena's disappearance, leaving only one remaining individual who fit the profile perfectly. His name was Arthur Pendleton, a 61-year-old grandfather, a respected local contractor, a man who had lived a quiet, seemingly blameless life just 15 miles away from the crime scene for over 30 years. To his friends, his neighbors, and his family, Pendleton was a pillar of the community, a gentle man who volunteered at youth sports and attended church every Sunday, a man incapable of malice. But the genetic compass did not lie. It pointed unswervingly at his doorstep, forcing undercover detectives to initiate a discreet, high-stakes surveillance operation to capture his current DNA and confirm the match beyond a shadow of a doubt. For 2 tense weeks, detectives shadowed Pendleton as he went about his mundane daily routine, waiting for him to discard something, anything, that could provide a fresh sample of his genetic material. They watched him buy groceries, pump gas, and sit at a local cafe, always careful to stay out of sight, knowing that a single mistake could tip him off and cause him to flee or destroy evidence. The moment of truth arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Pendleton walked into a fast food restaurant, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window, completely unaware of the eyes tracking his every move from across the street. When he finished his drink, he tossed the paper cup into a public trash can outside the establishment and walked away, disappearing into the crowded sidewalk. Within seconds, an undercover officer retrieved the discarded cup, sealing it in a biohazard bag, and rushed it to the state forensic laboratory for immediate, high-priority analysis. The lab technicians worked through the night, extracting the DNA from the rim of the fresh cup and running a direct comparison against the 32-year-old profile recovered from the 1994 crime scene evidence. The results sent shockwaves through the entire department. It was an absolute, undeniable, 1 in a billion match. The man who drank from the cup in 2026 was the exact same man who left his genetic signature on Elena's coffee cup in 1994. The arrest warrant was signed under the cover of darkness, and a heavily armed tactical unit swarmed Pendleton's suburban home at dawn, shattering the morning silence of his peaceful neighborhood. Neighbors looked on in utter disbelief and horror as the elderly grandfather was led out in handcuffs, his head bowed, his face a mask of shock as the ghosts of his past finally caught up with him. At the press conference later that afternoon, police officially announced that the Boston 1994 cold case was solved, displaying side-by-side photos of the faded 1994 evidence cup and the 2026 fast food cup that brought down a killer. The announcement sent a jolt of electricity through the city, proving that no matter how much time passes, no matter how deep a secret is buried, the truth cannot be outrun forever. As Arthur Pendleton sits in a cold interrogation room, facing a mountain of undeniable scientific evidence, the city of Boston is left to grapple with the terrifying reality of a monster hid in plain sight for over 3 decades. Michael Vance received the phone call he had waited a lifetime for, a moment of profound relief mixed with the bittersweet sorrow of knowing his parents never lived to see this day. The investigation has now shifted from a search for a missing girl to a meticulous reconstruction of Pendleton's life. As detective suspect, he may be linked to other unsolved disappearances across New England during the 90s. The empty coffee cup, once a symbol of a dead-end mystery and a family's eternal grief, now stands as a testament to the relentless march of justice and the power of science to illuminate the darkest corners of human history. The streets of South Boston feel a little lighter tonight, the lingering shadow of 1994 finally dispelled, but the chilling memory of Elena Vance will forever remain etched in the concrete, a reminder of a life stolen and a truth that refused to stay buried in the dark. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers cast long, rhythmic shadows against the vinyl siding of Arthur Pendleton's immaculate suburban home, shattering the pre-dawn stillness of a neighborhood built on the illusions of safety and predictability. For over 30 years, this man had meticulously constructed a fortress of normalcy, a life so thoroughly unremarkable that it served as the perfect camouflage for a monster. As the heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrinkled wrists, Pendleton didn't rage. He didn't cry out, and he didn't protest his innocence. He merely stared ahead with a cold, vacant vacancy that chilled the arresting officers to the bone. In the surrounding houses, curtains twitched and porch lights flickered on as bewildered neighbors stood on their lawns in their bathrobes, watching in utter disbelief as the quiet, reliable grandfather who had helped build their decks and fix their lawnmowers was loaded into the back of a secure transport vehicle. The silence of the morning was heavy, pregnant with a sudden, agonizing realization that the boogeyman hadn't been a distant phantom lurking in the dark alleys of South Boston. He had been living right next door, sharing their barbecues, smiling at their children, and breathing the same autumn air. At police headquarters, the atmosphere was an intense mixture of exhausted euphoria and grim determination as the cold case squad finally witnessed the culmination of 3 decades of agonizing, multi-generational police work. Inside the high-security evidence locker, the original cardboard box labeled Vance, Elena, 1994 sat open under the harsh fluorescent lights, its contents no longer a monument to failure, but a roadmap to conviction. Beside the yellowed police reports and the graining, faded Polaroids of the abandoned vehicle sat the 2 most critical pieces of the puzzle, a stained, 32-year-old paper coffee cup preserved in an airtight biohazard bag, and a modern, plastic fast food cup retrieved from a trash can less than 48 hours prior. To the naked eye, they were nothing more than ordinary trash, the mundane detritus of a coffee-drinking culture separated by a generation of technological progress. But to the forensic scientists who had unlocked their microscopic secrets, they were identical genetic mirrors, an unbreakable digital chain of custody linking a 61-year-old grandfather directly to the brutal, sudden disappearance of an innocent nursing student. The interrogation room was sterile, windowless, and suffocatingly quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the occasional scratching of a pen against a notepad. Arthur Pendleton sat motionless at the metal table, his hands folded neatly in front of him, looking more like a tired businessman waiting for a delayed flight than a suspected killer facing life in a maximum security penitentiary. Across from him sat veteran detective Marcus Hayes, a man who had spent the last 10 years of his career chasing the ghosts of 1994 and whose own mentor had retired without ever solving the Vance disappearance. Hayes laid down a series of photographs on the table, spreading them out slowly, deliberately, like a dealer presenting a winning hand of cards. First was the radiant, smiling face of Elena Vance on her graduation day. Next was the bleak, rain-slicked alleyway where her car had been found idling, and finally, a high-resolution printout of the genetic markers showing a definitive, 1 in a billion match between the 2 coffee cups. Pendleton's eyes scanned the images, his face remaining an unreadable mask of stoic indifference, a masterclass in psychological denial that he had practiced every single day for 32 long years. "We know it's you, Arthur," Detective Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "The science doesn't lie, it doesn't forget, and it doesn't give a damn about how good of a neighbor you've been for the last 30 years. Pendleton slowly looked up, his gaze locking onto the detective with a terrifying lack of emotion, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke his first words since his arrest. "A piece of garbage from 30 years ago doesn't prove anything, Detective. People lose things, people discard things, and people make mistakes." It was a calculated, defensive opening gambit, the desperate response of a man who believed that without a body, the state's case was nothing more than a circumstantial house of cards built on microscopic dust. But what Pendleton failed to realize was that the modern justice system no longer required a smoking gun or a bloody confession when it possessed the absolute, mathematical certainty of DNA genealogy. While the interrogation dragged on into the afternoon, a secondary, massive tactical operation was unfolding 15 miles away at Pendleton's suburban property and his commercial warehouse space in South Boston. A convoy of unmarked vans, forensic units, and heavy-duty excavation equipment descended upon his residence, transforming the beautifully landscaped backyard into a high-stakes crime scene. Ground-penetrating radar units were rolled across the manicured lawn, scanning the dark earth beneath the soil for anomalies, disturbances, or anything that might resemble a makeshift grave from the mid-90s. Neighbors watched in horror as forensic teams in white Tyvek suits began systematically dismantling a wooden shed that Pendleton had built with his own hands just 1 year after Elena vanished. Every tool, every piece of rusted hardware, and every square inch of the concrete foundation was subjected to chemical sprays designed to detect ancient, hidden bloodstains that had survived decades of washing and weathering. Inside the house, search teams combed through every closet, every floorboard, and every corner of the dark, cramped attic, looking for trophies, souvenirs that serial predators often keep to relive their crimes. They uncovered dozens of old photo albums, vintage electronics, and boxes of files related to Pendleton's construction business, tracking his movements through the city during the critical years of the 1990s. Among the clutter in the basement, hidden behind a false wall in a tool workbench, an investigator discovered a locked metal ammunition box coated in a thick layer of dust. When the lock was breached, the team found a collection of old newspaper clippings detailing various unsolved missing persons cases across New England, alongside several pieces of women's jewelry that did not belong to his current or former wives. The discoveries sent a collective chill down the spines of the investigative team. This was no longer just about solving the tragic murder of Elena Vance. This was about uncovering the hidden timeline of a systematic, calculated predator who may have used his mobile construction job to hunt in the shadows of the city. The news of the discovery and the unfolding search blasted across every major news network in Boston, drawing crowds of reporters, true crime investigators, and curious onlookers to the perimeter of the police tape. For the remaining members of the Vance family, the media circus was an overwhelming, painful reopening of a wound that had never truly healed. Michael Vance, Elena's younger brother, sat in his living room, his eyes glued to the television screen as images of the backyard excavation played on a continuous loop. The physical absence of his sister had been a constant, defining gravity in his life, shaping his relationships, his career, and his perception of the world. He remembered the last time he saw her, laughing as she ran out the door with her nursing scrubs over her arm, promising to bring home takeout after her shift. Now, 32 years later, he was staring at the face of the man who had stolen her future, a man who looked completely ordinary, a man who had enjoyed 3 decades of birthdays, holidays, and family milestones while Elena's life had been frozen in time at 22. Back in the interrogation room, Detective Hayes changed his tactics, moving away from the cold science of DNA and focusing heavily on the logistics of the night of November 14, 1994. He pulled out a vintage street map of South Boston, pointing a heavy finger at the intersection where Elena's car had been discovered idling in the cold rain. You were working a commercial renovation project just 2 blocks away from this exact spot in November of '94, Arthur," Hayes stated, placing a copy of old city building permits on the table. "You knew the neighborhood. You knew the blind spots where the streetlights were broken, and you knew exactly what time the late shift nurses from the hospital walked to their cars." Pendleton's eyes blinked rapidly, the first visible crack in his carefully constructed armor, as his past employment records pinned him directly to the geographical heart of the abduction zone. The illusion that he was a completely random stranger disconnected from the victim began to dissolve, replaced by the terrifying reality of a stalker who had used his daily routine to select, observe, and target his prey. The narrative of that fateful night began to reconstruct itself through the sheer force of circumstantial and physical evidence, painting a horrific picture of opportunity meeting malice. Investigators theorized that Pendleton had been waiting in the shadows of the alleyway, perhaps sitting in his own work truck, watching Elena as she walked toward her vehicle through the freezing mist. When she paused to open her car door, setting her coffee cup down to fumble with her keys, he had struck with terrifying speed and violence, overpowering her before she could even process the danger. The lack of blood at the scene suggested a swift, asphyxiation-style abduction or the presentation of a weapon that forced immediate compliance, neutralizing her ability to scream or fight back. He had forced her into his own vehicle, leaving her car running and her coffee warm, a chilling detail that highlighted the suddenness of the assault. What he didn't realize in his haste to escape into the dark Boston night was that his hand had brushed against her coffee cup, or perhaps he had knocked it over, leaving behind an invisible, permanent signature of his identity that would survive long after he forgot the details of the night. As night fell over the city, the search teams at Pendleton's property made a significant discovery that shifted the entire trajectory of the prosecution's strategy. Deep within the crawl space beneath the main house, embedded in the dry dirt, forensic anthropologists located a decomposed leather handbag containing a collection of identification cards, medical items, and a faded student badge bearing the name and photograph of Elena Vance. It was the definitive, undeniable link, the physical trophy that bridged the gap between the microscopic DNA on the coffee cup and the absolute reality of her abduction. When the photograph of the recovered handbag was brought into the interrogation room and placed directly before Arthur Pendleton, the silence that followed was suffocating. The elderly contractor stared at his sister's belongings, his breathing growing shallow, his hands trembling slightly as the realization hit him that his 32-year run of freedom had officially come to an end. The perfect crime had collapsed under the weight of a single, forgotten paper cup and a trophy he couldn't bring himself to destroy, proving that the past is never truly dead, it is simply waiting for the light to break through. The weight of the decades seemed to crash down upon Arthur Pendleton all at once within the suffocating confines of the interrogation room. The image of the degraded leather handbag, pulled from the damp earth beneath his own home, broke something fundamental inside his calculated exterior. His eyes, which had remained cold and detached for hours, suddenly darted around the room as if searching for an escape hatch that did not exist. The arrogance that had protected him for 32 years evaporated, leaving behind a frail, terrified old man whose carefully constructed empire of lies had vanished into thin air. Detective Hayes leaned forward, sensing the shift in the psychological tide, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper that filled the silence. "It's over, Arthur. The DNA put you at the scene, but this handbag puts Elena in your house. There is no jury in the world that will look at this and see anything other than a monster.
Tell me where she is."
Give her brother the peace he has earned after a lifetime of looking at the shadows. Pendleton's hands, liver-spotted and trembling, slowly rose to cover his face as a heavy, ragged sigh escaped his chest. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the mechanical click of the recording equipment and his own uneven breathing. When he finally lowered his hands, his expression was hollow, stripped of the grandfatherly warmth he had used to deceive his neighborhood for a generation. "I always knew this day would come," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a stark contrast to his previous defiance. Every time the doorbell rang, every time a police car drove past the house too slowly, I thought, this is it. You think you can forget, you think you can build a wall around that part of your life, but it just sits there in the dark, waiting. He stared at the photograph of Elena's student ID, the youthful face frozen in 1994, looking back at him across a chasm of stolen years. What followed was a chilling, unvarnished confession that detailed the mechanics of an urban nightmare delivered with a flat, detached precision that made the blood of the listening detectives run cold. Pendleton admitted that his presence in that South Boston alleyway on November 14, 1994, was far from accidental. He had spent weeks watching the late-shift workers from the local medical facilities, tracking their patterns, mapping out the blind spots where the neighborhood's infrastructure failed. Elena Vance had caught his attention because of her unyielding routine. She walked the same 3 blocks at the exact same time every Tuesday night, completely unaware that a predator was calculating the distance between the street lamps. On the night of the abduction, he had parked his construction van in the darkest corner of the alley, waiting with the engine off, listening to the rain pelt against the metal roof until the sound of her footsteps signaled the arrival of his opportunity. When Elena approached her car, her attention occupied by her keys and the steaming cup of coffee in her hand, Pendleton had stepped out from behind a brick dumpster, neutralizing her before she could even turn her head. He described the terrifying efficiency of the assault: a heavy, gloved hand clamped over her mouth, a knife pressed against her throat, and a whispered threat that paralyzed her with primitive fear. He had forced her into the rear of his van, a space lined with heavy plastic sheeting and construction tools, before she could utter a single cry for help. In his haste to slide the side door shut and accelerate away from the curb, his arm had violently brushed against the passenger side door of Elena's idling car, knocking her paper coffee cup against the console and leaving behind the microscopic traces of skin cells that would eventually seal his fate 32 years later. As Pendleton spoke, describing the long, silent drive out of the city limits toward an isolated, half-completed commercial foundation he was working on in the rural outskirts of Massachusetts, the true horror of his double life became sickeningly apparent. He had used his legitimate occupation as a contractor to facilitate, conceal, and bury his crimes, leveraging his access to heavy machinery and fresh concrete to create permanent graves. He led detectives through the final hours of Elena's life, a harrowing narrative of survival instinct meeting cold, sociopathic determination, culminating in her death by strangulation in the early morning hours of November 15th. He had buried her deep beneath what is now the foundation of a suburban strip mall, a location he chose specifically because he knew thousands of tons of steel and concrete would be poured over the site within 48 hours of her disappearance. While the confession was being recorded, a second wave of shockwaves rippled through the Boston Police Department as crime analysts began cross-referencing Pendleton's newly revealed timeline with other cold cases from the mid-90s. The locked ammunition box discovered in his basement, filled with newspaper clippings of vanished women, was not a collection of random true crime memorabilia. It was a ledger of death. The jewelry items, carefully preserved and hidden behind the false wall of his workbench, were systematically matched to descriptions of personal belongings missing from victims of unsolved disappearances across 3 different states. Investigators suddenly realized they were not dealing with a single, isolated act of violence, but with a highly organized, undetected serial offender who had operated with total impunity during the golden age of American highway construction. The news of Pendleton's confession and the revelation of his potential status as a serial killer exploded into the national media, completely paralyzing the community of South Boston and the quiet suburb where he had spent his retirement. Outside the police precinct, a sea of satellite trucks, reporters, and true crime podcasters formed a permanent encampment, demanding answers about how a man could commit such atrocities while maintaining the facade of a devoted family man. At the site of the strip mall identified in the confession, heavy construction equipment was mobilized not to build, but to destroy, as forensic archaeologists prepared to tear through layers of concrete to retrieve the remains of a girl who had been missing for over 3 decades. Michael Vance stood at the edge of the perimeter, wrapped in a heavy winter coat, watching the jackhammers break apart the asphalt, his face a mask of profound sorrow and absolute resolve. The psychological fallout within Pendleton's own family was catastrophic. His adult children, who had grown up believing their father was a gentle, hard-working pillar of the community, issued a brief, heartbreaking statement through an attorney, expressing their complete devastation and total alienation from the man they thought they knew. The holidays, the graduation parties, the quiet moments of fatherly advice, all of it had been retroactively poisoned by the knowledge that he had returned home from burying young women to tuck them into bed. The neighborhood where he lived became a ghost town of suspicion, as former friends looked at their own properties, wondering if the man who had helped them landscape their gardens had left secrets buried beneath their own flowers. As the third day of the post-arrest investigation drew to a close, forensic teams working under floodlights at the excavation site finally made a somber discovery deep beneath the cracked foundation of the old building. Wrapped in the remains of the heavy plastic sheeting described in the confession, they located human skeletal remains, alongside the distinctive silver cross necklace that Elena Vance's mother had given her for her 21st birthday. The search was over. The ghost that had haunted Boston since 1994 had finally been brought home, her story pulled from the dark earth by the unyielding march of modern forensic science. The empty coffee cup that had sat in an evidence locker for 32 years had done its job, transforming an impossible mystery into an undeniable reality and proving that while justice can be delayed by decades, the truth possesses a weight that can crush even the most carefully constructed fortress of lies. The flashlights of the forensic recovery team cut through the subterranean dampness of the excavated trench, casting long, eerie shadows across the broken concrete shards and the dark New England earth. 32 years of compression had turned the soil into a dense, unforgiving vault, but beneath the structural layers of the old strip mall foundation, the truth could no longer be contained. The recovery of Elena Vance's remains was not a clinical, detached procedure. It was a solemn, agonizing resurrection of a tragedy that had paralyzed a city for more than 3 decades. Each shovelful of dirt removed by the forensic anthropologists was sifted with extreme care, uncovering not just skeletal fragments, but the enduring remnants of a life violently interrupted. The silver cross necklace, tarnished by decades of chemical exposure from the surrounding soil but still perfectly intact, gleamed under the harsh halogen floodlights like a beacon of absolute certainty. It was the final, devastating exclamation point on a mathematical equation that had begun with an invisible speck of DNA on a discarded paper cup. As the physical evidence was carefully cataloged and transported back to the medical examiner's office under a heavy police escort, the focus of the task force pivoted toward the chilling contents of Arthur Pendleton's locked ammunition box. The collection of jewelry and weathered newspaper clippings was no longer viewed as mere circumstantial hoarding. It was treated as an active criminal archive, a physical record of an undetected predator's hunting ground. A specialized team of digital analysts, behavioral profilers, and regional cold case detectives gathered in a secure war room at the Boston Police Headquarters, mapping out Pendleton's geographic movements from 1985 to 2010. By overlaying his commercial construction contracts with interstate highway databases and historical missing persons reports, a terrifying pattern began to crystallize on the digital maps. Pendleton hadn't just operated in the dark corners of South Boston. His employment as an independent contractor had granted him a mobile, highly versatile cover that allowed him to traverse the entire northeastern seaboard completely undetected. The jewelry pieces found behind the false wall of his basement workbench were laid out on velvet mats, photographed in high resolution, and broadcasted to law enforcement agencies across New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. Within 48 hours, the encrypted teletype systems were flooded with incoming inquiries from small-town police departments that had been haunted by their own localized ghost stories for decades. A heavy gold charm bracelet with a distinct engraving matched the description of an item belonging to a 20-year-old college student who had vanished from a bus stop in Providence, Rhode Island, in the summer of 1991. A pair of antique pearl earrings corresponded precisely with an unsolved abduction case out of Hartford, Connecticut, dating back to October 1988. The staggering scope of the investigation escalated from a single, resolved Boston cold case into a massive, multi-jurisdictional serial homicide inquiry, painting Pendleton as one of the most prolific, disciplined predators in modern regional history. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere shifted from triumphant relief to an intense, suffocating battle of psychological endurance. Detective Hayes sat across from Pendleton, who looked noticeably smaller, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own revealed history, his previous stoicism replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. The detective placed a new series of photographs on the metal table, not of Elena Vance, but of the other young women whose lives had been cataloged in the ammunition box. "The wall you built around your past is completely gone, Arthur," Hayes said, his voice flat, devoid of anger, carrying only the absolute gravity of an inescapable reality. "Elena is home. Her family has her back. But these girls are still out there in the dark, buried under the foundations of buildings you forgot you worked on. It's time to clear the ledger completely." Pendleton looked down at the photographs, his fingers twitching slightly against his prison-issued jumpsuit as he stared into the eyes of victims he hadn't thought about in 20, 30 years. The sociopathic compartmentalization that had allowed him to transition seamlessly from a horrific assault to a quiet family dinner was beginning to fracture permanently under the relentless pressure of scientific and physical proof. He began to speak again, his voice dropping to a low, mechanical monotone that was captured by the studio-quality microphones in the walls, describing the logistics of a decades-long hunting campaign. He explained how the expanding interstate highway systems of the late 20th century provided the perfect environment for a mobile predator, offering infinite escape routes, disconnected local police departments, and a constant influx of transient, vulnerable targets. He detailed how he used his white commercial construction van as both a mobile staging ground and a camouflage device, allowing him to park in industrial zones, near transit hubs, and along dark suburban roads without drawing a second glance from passing patrol cars. The lack of centralized databases and DNA sharing between states in the 1980s and 1990s meant that as long as he crossed a state line after an abduction, the local authorities would treat the incident as an isolated runaway case, never connecting the dots to a contractor working a temporary job just a few miles away. The cold, analytical precision with which he described his methodology revealed a man who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as logistical challenges to be solved, manipulated, and erased through the application of his professional skills. Outside the walls of the precinct, the city of Boston was forced to confront a deep, systemic sense of collective guilt and horror. The realization that a systematic killer had lived, worked, and thrived in their midst for over 30 years raised uncomfortable questions about the limitations of past law enforcement techniques and the ease with which a monster could blend into the fabric of ordinary suburban life. The local media outlets provided continuous, sober coverage of the unfolding investigation, interviewing former neighbors who recalled Pendleton as an unassuming, overly helpful man who always volunteered to clear snow from their driveways or help repair damaged roofs after winter storms. This jarring duality, the helpful neighbor by day and the apex predator by night, created a profound psychological shockwave through the community, destroying the comforting illusion that danger always wears an easily recognizable face. For Michael Vance, the recovery of his sisters remains brought an intense, overwhelming wave of emotional exhaustion that transcended the simple concept of closure. Standing outside the medical examiner's facility as the transport vehicle arrived, he felt the crushing weight of a 32-year search finally lift from his chest, leaving behind a vast, quiet emptiness where the anger and uncertainty had resided for most of his life. The battle for justice was no longer a desperate hunt for answers. It was now a clinical, legal process designed to ensure that Arthur Pendleton would never again see a horizon that wasn't bordered by razor wire. As the task force continued to unearth the hidden history of the ammunition box, the legacy of the 1994 cold case transformed from a story of a forgotten tragedy into a historic testament to the unyielding power of modern forensic science to rewrite the past and illuminate the darkest secrets of the human soul. The winter of 2026 descended upon New England with a brutal, bone-chilling intensity, burying the ongoing excavation sites under layers of thick ice and heavy snow, yet the frozen ground could no longer protect the secrets of Arthur Pendleton. Inside the climate-controlled offices of the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit, the atmosphere was thick with the silent, frenetic energy of a historical war room. The single thread that had begun with Elena Vance's coffee cup had now unraveled into a massive web covering 5 states and spanning nearly a quarter of a century. On the massive magnetic whiteboard covering the central wall, Pendleton's life had been dissected into a highly detailed, chronological timeline, flanked by black and white Polaroids, digitized driver's license photos, and colorful pushpins marking the exact locations of every construction project he had ever overseen. To look at the board was to look into the jaws of a silent, highly efficient machine that had navigated the blind spots of American society with terrifying precision. The Multi-Jurisdictional Task Force, now officially codenamed Operation Cold Horizon, had expanded to include specialized agents from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and cold case detectives from Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and Vermont. The primary objective was no longer just building an airtight case for the murder of Elena Vance. That case was already solidified by the absolute certainty of the DNA match and the recovery of her silver cross necklace. The real battle was now against time, decay, and the fading memories of aging witnesses as investigators raced to identify the owners of the other trophies found inside Pendleton's hidden ammunition box. Every piece of jewelry, every scratched ring, every tarnished earring was treated as a living victim crying out from the dark, requiring a level of microscopic forensic scrutiny that simply did not exist when they were stolen. Among the items, a vintage silver charm bracelet with a tiny, engraved horseshoe charm became the focus of intense investigation for a team of detectives from Providence, Rhode Island. Utilizing advanced macrophotography and digital enhancement techniques, forensic technicians managed to isolate a faint, near-invisible serial number stamped onto the inside of the bracelet's clasp. This tiny clue was run through historical manufacturing registries from the late 1980s, eventually tracing the piece back to a small jewelry boutique that operated in downtown Providence. By cross-referencing the store's surviving paper records with missing persons archives from the summer of 1989, a name finally emerged from the fog of forgotten history: Melissa Crane, a 19-year-old university student who vanished without a trace while walking to a late-night study session. The geographic overlay matched perfectly. In July 1989, Arthur Pendleton's construction firm had been awarded a state contract to repair a series of concrete overpasses along Interstate 95, situated less than a quarter-mile from the path Melissa Crane took on the night she disappeared. The modus operandi was identical to the Vance abduction, a young woman operating on a highly predictable, isolated schedule, targeted by a predator who used the noise, chaos, and heavy machinery of a nocturnal construction site to mask his movements. When the Providence detectives contacted Melissa's aging sister, presenting her with the high-resolution photograph of the silver charm bracelet, the line went dead for a long, agonizing minute before the sound of quiet, generational weeping filled the speakerphone. The trophy had found its name, and another family was pulled out of the purgatory of perpetual uncertainty. Back in the Boston interrogation room, the physical and psychological toll of the continuous questioning was visibly eroding Pendleton's remaining defenses. He sat slumped in the metal chair, his eyes bloodshot, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were stark white under the harsh fluorescent lights. Detective Hayes was no longer alone. He was joined by Special Agent Evelyn Vance, no relation to the victim, a veteran behavioral profiler who understood that a serial predator's greatest weakness is often his own twisted pride in his work. "You are meticulous, Arthur," Agent Vance said, her voice smooth, analytical, offering a false sense of professional validation that was designed to lower his defensive barriers. "Most guys who operate for this long make messy mistakes. They leave trails. But you treated this like your construction jobs. You measured twice, you cut once, and you poured the concrete thick. Tell us about Providence. Tell us how you managed to keep Melissa Crane hidden for so long." Pendleton's head slowly lifted, a faint, deeply unsettling smirk playing at the corners of his chins before his face smoothed back into a mask of cold indifference. The validation of his criminal intelligence was a drug he could not resist. For 30 years, he had been forced to keep his achievements entirely to himself, unable to brag to his friends, his neighbors, or his children about the terrifying power he wielded in the dark. "Providence was easy," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate against the sterile walls of the room. In '89, the police were so busy chasing the local mobs and dealing with a crack epidemic that they didn't even look at the construction zones. They thought she ran away to New York with a boyfriend. They didn't understand that a bridge isn't just a way to get over a river. It's a monument made of empty spaces, if you know where to look. The confession that followed over the next 4 hours was a chilling masterclass in structural psychopathy. Pendleton detailed how he had used his authority as a site foreman to modify the structural pores of large concrete pillars, creating temporary hollow voids within the massive wooden frameworks before the final industrial mixtures were delivered by the mixing trucks. He described, with a stomach-turning level of technical detail, how he had placed Melissa Crane's body within the hollow core of a support pillar for an interstate ramp, knowing that within minutes, thousands of pounds of wet cement would encase her in a permanent, indestructible tomb of stone and steel. He had built his crimes directly into the very infrastructure of the United States, transforming the modern highway system into an invisible, sprawling cemetery for his forgotten victims. As the tape recorded his words, detectives in Rhode Island were immediately dispatched to the specific interstate overpass Pendleton had identified, bringing with them heavy-duty concrete scanning arrays and specialized acoustic sensors. The realization that thousands of commuters had driven over the final resting place of a missing girl every single day for 37 years sent a wave of profound disgust and horror through the entire state. The logistical nightmare of retrieving a body from the structural core of an active highway support pillar was unprecedented, forcing engineers and forensic experts to design a highly complex, surgical extraction plan that would preserve both the structural integrity of the bridge and the fragile skeletal evidence hidden deep within its heart. Outside the legal and forensic circles, the public reaction to the unfolding revelations was mutating from simple true crime fascination into a deep, pervasive fury. Vigils began to form outside the Boston State House and the various excavation sites as citizens demanded systemic changes to how old missing persons files were archived and tracked. The case underscored a terrifying historical truth. During the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the lack of digital communication between state police departments had created a perfect ecosystem for mobile predators to thrive, leaving behind a trail of broken families who were left completely in the dark because their loved ones happened to disappear across an invisible state line. For Michael Vance, the resolution of his sister's case had transformed him into an unofficial anchor for the other families who were now being thrust into the terrifying light of Pendleton's confessions. He spent his evenings on the phone with strangers from Rhode Island and Connecticut, offering a unique, empathetic perspective that only someone who had spent 32 years waiting for a phone call could provide. "The truth doesn't make the pain go away," he told Melissa Crane's sister during a late-night conversation, his eyes looking out over the snow-covered streets of South Boston. "But it stops the clock. It stops you from wondering if they are still cold, if they are still scared, or if they are still out there somewhere calling your name. It brings them back to you, even if it's only in pieces." As the 5th chapter of this dark saga drew to a close, the snow continued to fall outside the windows of the precinct, covering the city in a deceptive blanket of pure, clean white. But beneath the ice, beneath the concrete, and within the digital databases of the modern justice system, the light was finally winning. The paper coffee cup from 1994 had acted as a key, unlocking a door that Arthur Pendleton had sworn would remain sealed forever, proving that no matter how much concrete a monster pours over his sins, the truth possesses an unyielding, elemental force that will eventually crack the stone and demand to be heard. The freezing winds sweeping off the dark waters of the Providence River did absolutely nothing to deter the massive, swelling crowds gathering behind the heavy steel barricades, their collective breath pluming in the icy air as they stared up at the monolithic concrete pillars of Interstate 95. What had been, for nearly 4 decades, a completely mundane stretch of urban infrastructure, a deafening artery of commuter traffic carrying thousands of oblivious drivers every single day, was now violently transformed into the most macabre and logistically terrifying crime scene in Rhode Island history. Structural engineers, bundled in heavy neon parkas and shivering under the harsh glare of portable halogen floodlights, pored intensely over faded, 37-year-old architectural blueprints, their faces drawn tight, with grim determination. The sheer mechanics of the extraction were an unprecedented, heart-stopping tightrope walk between delicate forensic preservation and catastrophic structural failure. One wrong mathematical calculation with the industrial, diamond-tipped core drills, one shift in the load-bearing tension, and the entire multi-ton overpass could collapse under its own colossal weight. The deafening, high-pitched screech of heavy metal tearing into ancient, hardened stone echoed through the frozen canyon of the city, a harsh, mechanical scream that felt like a long-overdue, visceral cry for justice tearing through the silence of the night. For Melissa Crane's shattered family, who sat huddled together in a heated, military-grade command tent just yards away, the cacophony of the heavy machinery was a brutal, overwhelming symphony marking the end of a lifetime spent drowning in an agonizing, unyielding mystery. As the massive, cylindrical saw finally breached the central void of the pillar, a heavy, suffocating, almost religious silence fell over the 100-person crew, cutting through the sensory overload of the active construction site as the drills were powered down. A specialized, robotic fiber-optic camera, no larger than the head of a flashlight, was carefully threaded deep into the dark, suffocating hollow of the concrete, beaming a high-definition, infrared video feed directly back to the glowing monitors in the command center. There, preserved in the airtight, impenetrable darkness of the cement tomb since the sweltering summer of 1989, were the unmistakable, heartbreaking skeletal remains of a 19-year-old college student, curled in a tight fetal position, still wearing the tattered, dust-covered remains of the denim jacket she was last seen wearing. The collective gasp that went up from the hardened law enforcement officers in the tent was a visceral, physical release of decades-old tension, a stark, terrifying realization that the nightmare they were hunting was not a phantom of exaggeration, but a physical reality engineered into the very backbone of the American highway system. This wasn't just another chapter of a cold case solved. It was the unearthing of a masterclass in sociopathic architecture, a revelation that sent a profound, paralyzing shock through a community that suddenly realized they had been driving their children over a hidden graveyard for an entire generation. While the delicate, millimeter-by-millimeter extraction process unfolded under the floodlights in Rhode Island, the relentless gears of the multi-state task force continued to grind forward inside the secure, heavily guarded war room back in Boston, pivoting sharply toward the third major trophy recovered from the dusty basement ammunition box. A pair of antique, gold-set pearl earrings sat perfectly preserved on their black velvet display mat under the bright laboratory lights, a stark, elegant contrast to the violent, bloody history they represented, pointing the investigators directly toward the affluent, heavily wooded suburbs of Hartford, Connecticut, in the autumn of 1988. The missing mystery of 26-year-old Sarah Jenkins was a haunting, legendary local ghost story that had completely terrified the wealthy state capital, a case completely devoid of the typical, messy hallmarks of a violent street abduction. Sarah was a universally beloved elementary school teacher, a vibrant young woman whose life was a perfect portrait of suburban predictability, who had simply vanished off the face of the earth on a crisp Tuesday evening while driving home from a late parent-teacher conference. Her pristine, late-model sedan had been found parked at a strange, haphazard angle near the unpaved entrance of a massive, half-built luxury housing development, the driver's side door securely locked, her purse sitting safely on the passenger seat, and the engine completely cold to the touch. But it was the bizarre clues left at the abandoned scene that had baffled, frustrated, and completely derailed Hartford detectives for 38 years. A perfectly unblemished, bright red apple sat precisely on the center of the hood of her car, completely untouched by the overnight frost, seemingly mocking the frantic investigators who swarmed the perimeter the next morning. It was a detail so strange, so deeply unsettling, and so wildly out of place that it dominated the local newspaper headlines for months on end, fueling wild, desperate theories of obsessed stalkers, secret admirers, and even occult rituals, while completely masking the terrifying, utilitarian truth of a monster passing quietly through town. Pendleton's highly lucrative contracting firm had been hired to pour the massive, subterranean foundation walls for that exact housing development, a multi-million-dollar project that granted him completely unrestricted, unquestioned nocturnal access to the sprawling, isolated labyrinth of newly cut dirt roads and deep excavation pits. For 38 long, agonizing years, the Jenkins family had tortured themselves with the unsolvable puzzle of that apple, wondering if Sarah had stopped to speak to someone she knew, stepping willingly into the dark woods, entirely oblivious to the horrifying fact that the answer lay in the heavy yellow machinery idling just a few hundred yards away in the dark. The air inside the windowless Boston interrogation room had grown incredibly stale, smelling heavily of cold coffee, nervous, sour sweat, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of pure, unadulterated fear as Arthur Pendleton finally realized the absolute totality of his undoing. The 61-year-old serial killer, whose carefully curated facade of a gentle, helpful suburban grandfather had completely disintegrated under the weight of his own hubris, was now locked in a high-stakes psychological death match with Special Agent Evelyn Vance, a woman who possessed the uncanny, terrifying ability to navigate the darkest, most twisted corridors of the psychopathic mind. She didn't yell, she didn't bang her fists violently on the scarred metal table. She simply placed the high-resolution photograph of the antique pearl earrings directly in front of his tightly folded hands, her voice a calm, lethal, surgical whisper that cut straight through his remaining psychological defenses. Hartford, October 1988, Arthur, she stated plainly, leaning back in her heavy metal chair and deliberately letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room became almost physically painful. Sarah Jenkins, the school teacher. You poured the deep concrete foundations for the Oak Ridge Estates development, a beautiful, affluent neighborhood, big houses, deep basements, wealthy families. You took her earrings, kept them in a box like loose change, and you left an apple on the hood of her car. Why the apple, Arthur? Was it a sick, twisted game with the police? Or was it just a distraction to buy yourself time? Pendleton's bloodshot eyes locked onto the photograph, his breathing growing shallow and ragged, a strange, deeply terrifying glint of pride flickering briefly in his dull eyes as he was finally invited to explain the masterpiece of misdirection that had fooled an entire, highly trained state police department for nearly 4 decades. He wet his dry, cracked lips, the sound of his tongue against his teeth magnified deafeningly by the recording equipment hidden in the walls, and slowly began to dismantle the 38-year-old mystery with a casual, horribly detached tone of a seasoned mechanic explaining a routine engine repair to a customer. He explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that the apple wasn't a romantic gesture, a symbolic signature, or a clue left for the detectives. It was a highly calculated, improvised trap, a simple piece of bait he had taken from his own insulated lunchbox when he noticed Sarah's headlights approaching the isolated, poorly lit entrance of his construction site. With sickening, architectural precision, Pendleton detailed exactly how he had stood dead center in the middle of the dark, unpaved dirt road, wearing his high-visibility, reflective contractor's vest and a bright yellow hard hat, waving a heavy orange flashlight to flag her down, perfectly playing the role of a municipal worker warning a lost driver of a dangerous hazard ahead. The uniform was the ultimate camouflage, a universal, deeply ingrained symbol of authority and safety that completely bypassed Sarah's natural, primal survival instincts, causing her to roll down her window into the freezing autumn air without a second thought of danger. As she stopped the vehicle, completely disarmed by the comforting sight of a polite, older man in a work uniform offering assistance, he had casually placed the apple on the hood of her car, leaning in close to the window to tell her the road was washed out and offering to guide her in turning around safely. The sheer, terrifying banality of the interaction was his greatest weapon. In the exact, fleeting second, she shifted the car into park, glancing down at the apple in momentary confusion. Pendleton had reached violently through the open window, his heavily muscled, calloused forearm locking around her throat in a brutal, inescapable chokehold. There was no desperate chase through the dark woods, no violent, screaming struggle that would leave crucial DNA under her fingernails, just a terrifying, silent, Overwhelming suppression executed perfectly by a man whose massive hands were conditioned by decades of moving heavy stone and steel. He dragged her unconscious body out of the driver's seat, locked her car doors manually to delay the police timeline and preserve the scene, and carried her effortlessly into the sprawling, pitch-black footprint of the housing development where his heavy earth-moving equipment sat waiting like massive steel beasts in the freezing October night. The Apple remained perfectly positioned on the hood, a perfect, bizarre distraction that successfully derailed the entire initial forensic investigation, sending desperate detectives chasing ghosts, local peeping toms, and useless behavioral profiles while he calmly went to work on a massive, newly dug foundation trench. Pendleton confessed, staring dead into Agent Vance's eyes, that he had placed Sarah's body deep within the negative space of a massive, load-bearing retaining wall, a critical structural barrier designed to hold back tons of earth for a luxury swimming pool, sealing her within thousands of pounds of reinforced concrete before the sun even peeked over the Connecticut horizon. He had even returned to the site repeatedly for the next 6 months to finish the contract, smiling warmly and waving at the wealthy family who eventually bought the property, watching their young children play tag in a beautiful backyard that was built directly on top of his darkest secret, reveling quietly in the godlike power of his invisible monstrosity. The unprecedented live broadcast of Pendleton's Hartford confession shattered whatever lingering, fragile illusions of safety the New England public still clung to, triggering a massive, uncontrollable wave of pure, unadulterated panic across the affluent suburbs of Connecticut as terrified homeowners stared out their windows at their own retaining walls, their own patios, and their own deep basements. The sensational headlines completely dominated every screen, screaming cold case, serial killer maps out subterranean graveyard, fueling a terrifying, viral paranoia that fundamentally and permanently altered the way citizens viewed the mundane urban landscape surrounding them. The Boston 1994 cold case solved had rapidly metastasized into a sprawling, terrifying hydra, an unprecedented logistical, legal, and engineering nightmare that forced the governors of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut to declare special, joint states of emergency to free up federal funding for the massive, destructive forensic excavations now required. Heavy, industrial demolition equipment was immediately mobilized and dispatched to the Hartford luxury estate under heavy police escort, forcing the utterly traumatized current owners to abruptly evacuate a multi-million-dollar property that was about to be systematically torn apart, stone by heavy stone, by a small army of structural engineers and forensic archaeologists. The sheer, staggering scale of the operation was a visual testament to the destructive, multi-generational impact of a single man whose crimes had been perfectly insulated by the rapid, unregulated expansion of American suburban sprawl in the late 20th century, turning the American dream into a literal nightmare. Back in the Boston War Room, the massive digital map glowing on the wall was no longer just a timeline of Arthur Pendleton's life. It was a terrifying, bleeding canvas of red pushpins, each one representing a potential burial site, a forgotten victim, a family frozen in eternal, agonizing grief, waiting for a phone call. The powerful district attorneys from 5 different counties convened in a highly classified, unprecedented legal summit to untangle the monumental, labyrinthine web of prosecuting a man whose crimes spanned multiple sovereign jurisdictions and crossed over decades of constantly evolving criminal law. They unanimously agreed to centralize the primary, spearhead prosecution in Boston, utilizing the airtight, mathematically indisputable DNA evidence from Elena Vance's preserved coffee cup as the foundational bedrock to secure a rapid capital murder conviction, ensuring that even if the complex bridge and retaining wall extractions failed to yield usable, prosecutable evidence due to environmental decay, Pendleton would never breathe free air again. The public spectacle outside the courthouse was completely overwhelming, a relentless, deafening 24-hour news cycle that transformed Michael Vance from a quietly grieving brother into a reluctant, fiercely stoic spokesperson for an entire generation of victims' families, his weary face a constant, sobering reminder of the horrific human cost buried beneath the sensationalist headlines. He stood tall before a massive bank of microphones on the icy granite steps of the Boston courthouse, his voice echoing clearly over the sea of satellite trucks and flashing cameras, declaring that the monster's reign of terror was absolutely, irrevocably over, completely demolished by the unyielding, relentless power of modern forensic science and the stubborn refusal of a few dedicated detectives to ever let a cold case truly die. But even as the massive legal machinery geared up to crush Arthur Pendleton under the full, devastating weight of the justice system, the exhausted investigators back in the war room knew their work was far from over. The rusted metal ammunition box still held 3 more pieces of unidentified jewelry, 3 more silent cries for help, 3 more structural nightmares waiting patiently in the dark to be pulled violently into the light. The unrelenting grip of winter tightened its hold on the city of Hartford, Connecticut, as industrial excavators and heavy pneumatic jackhammers began the painstaking process of dismantling the backyard of the luxury estate on Oak Ridge Drive. For 38 years, a family had lived, laughed, and raised children in a home bordered by a beautifully landscaped concrete retaining wall, entirely unaware that the structural barrier was actually a tomb for a missing young woman. Under the glaring warmth of massive portable heaters and floodlights that turned the freezing night into artificial day, forensic archaeologists worked in tandem with demolition crews, treating each fracture in the hardened cement with the utmost reverence. The high-pitched whine of diamond-toothed saws cutting through the reinforced rebar echoed through the valley, a sound that the community welcomed as the literal shattering of a 4-decade-old lie. As the outermost layers of structural concrete finally fell away, revealing the negative space within the load-bearing wall, the specialized recovery team located the skeletal remains of Sarah Jenkins, her wrists still bound with industrial zip ties, and her silver medical alert bracelet still draped loosely over her wrist bone. The recovery of Sarah Jenkins marked the 3rd definitive success for Operation Cold Horizon, but inside the high-security command center in Boston, the atmosphere remained incredibly tense, devoid of any celebratory relief. The massive wall calendar had clicked forward into the early months of 2026, and the legal teams were working around the clock, knowing that Arthur Pendleton's defense attorneys were preparing a massive omnibus motion to challenge the admissibility of the genetic genealogy data. The 4th trophy from the dusty ammunition box now lay beneath the intense magnification of the laboratory's stereo microscopes, a heavily tarnished silver signet ring featuring an intricate engraving of a weeping willow tree. Unlike the previous items, which had been linked to victims through serial numbers or unique heirloom designs, this ring was a standard piece of costume jewelry popular in the late 1980s, forcing investigators to rely purely on geographic mapping and historical employment logs. Detective Hayes and Special Agent Vance sat huddled over a digitized map of the northeastern United States, their eyes tracking a series of red lines that traced Pendleton's commercial travel paths during the spring and summer of 1992. During this specific window, his construction firm had been contracted by the federal government to expand a series of concrete drainage culverts and spillways along the border of upstate New York and Vermont, a desolate region characterized by dense forests, winding mountain roads, and vast pockets of cellular dead zones. The task force began a meticulous, systematic review of missing persons databases across 3 separate counties, looking for any unsolved disappearances that coincided with the exact weeks Pendleton's crew was pouring concrete in the rural town of Plattsburgh. A breakthrough occurred when a retired sheriff's deputy from Clinton County called the hotline, his voice trembling as he recalled the May 1992 disappearance of 17-year-old high school track star Rebecca Lowe, a case that had completely devastated the rural farming community and remained the biggest unsolved mystery in the county's history. Rebecca had gone for her routine evening run along a scenic county highway that skirted the edge of a massive state park, a path she had taken hundreds of times without incident. When she failed to return home for dinner, her father and brothers had retraced her steps, finding only one of her running shoes discarded in a ditch on the side of the road, alongside a fresh patch of tire tracks that indicated a vehicle had accelerated violently away from the shoulder. The local police had launched a massive search through the dense wilderness, utilizing helicopters, bloodhounds, and hundreds of local volunteers, but the thick forest canopy and a torrential downpour on the second day of the search had washed away any potential physical evidence. The investigation had rapidly grown cold, with local authorities operating under the tragic assumption that Rebecca had been abducted by a transient trucker traveling along the interstate, never realizing that a local infrastructure project just 2 miles away was being managed by a disciplined serial predator. Inside the sterile, windowless interrogation room, the power dynamic had completely shifted, with Arthur Pendleton now displaying signs of profound physical and cognitive exhaustion. He sat slumped forward, his chin resting against his chest, his breathing heavy and uneven as the reality of his multi-jurisdictional exposure began to suffocate his sociopathic ego. Agent Vance adjusted the brightness of the overhead monitor, bringing up a high-resolution photograph of the silver signet ring with the weeping willow engraving, alongside a vintage photograph of Rebecca Lowe smiling proudly next to her high school track trophies. Plattsburgh, New York, May 1992, Arthur. Agent Vance said, her voice dropping to a smooth, unyielding tone that brooked no deception. You were building the concrete spillway for the Regional Flood Control Project. Rebecca Lowe went out for a run and never came home. You took her ring, and you kept it behind your workbench for 34 years. Tell us how you caught her, Arthur. Tell us where you put her. Pendleton slowly raised his head, his eyes blinking heavily against the harsh fluorescent glare, a hollow, bitter laugh escaping his throat before he began to speak in a low, gravelly rasp that was instantly captured by the recording arrays. The runners are always the hardest to catch, he muttered, his voice devoid of any human empathy, sounding completely like a hunter discussing a difficult piece of game. They have stamina, they fight hard, and they don't give up easy when you trap them in the dark. He proceeded to detail the logistics of the May 1992 abduction with a terrifying level of clarity, explaining how he had noticed Rebecca's routine during his daily commutes from the construction staging area to his motel. He had purposely chosen a section of the county road where the cell signal faded to nothing and where a sharp curve in the asphalt prevented oncoming drivers from seeing more than 50 yards ahead, creating a temporary blind spot in the middle of the rural landscape. On the evening of May 12th, Pendleton had staged a breakdown, parking his white commercial van on the shoulder of the road with the hazard lights blinking and the hood propped open, completely disguising his malicious intent behind the universal image of a stranded motorist in need of assistance. As Rebecca rounded the curve, her pace slowing naturally as she approached the vehicle, Pendleton had stepped out from the front bumper, holding a large paper map and politely asking if she knew the directions to the nearest interstate on-ramp. The innocence of the request completely disarmed her athletic defenses, causing her to step closer to the open side door of the van to look at the map, completely unaware that the predator had already removed the interior door handles and lined the floor with heavy industrial plastic. In a fraction of a second, Pendleton had lunged forward, using his immense upper body strength to lift her completely off her feet and slam her into the rear cargo bay before she could even draw enough breath to scream. During the violent struggle inside the vehicle, Rebecca had fought back with desperate, feral intensity, clawing at his face and kicking wildly at the metal walls, managing to dislodge one of her running shoes, which flew out the open door into the mud just as Pendleton slammed the heavy slider shut. He confessed that he had been forced to use a heavy canvas cargo strap to restrain her wrists, a detail that perfectly explained why her signet ring had been stripped from her finger during the altercation, sliding into a crack in the floorboards where he discovered it days later during a routine cleaning. Instead of risking a long drive with a captive victim, Pendleton had immediately driven the van directly into the restricted, dark perimeter of his active construction site, using his master keys to unlock the security gates and park hidden behind a massive row of earth-moving equipment. He had ended her life within 30 minutes of her abduction, using a heavy piece of nylon utility rope before utilizing his authority as the night shift foreman to conceal her body in the one place he knew no human eyes would ever look. With sickening technical precision, Pendleton explained that he had placed Rebecca's body directly into the interior framework of a massive, subterranean concrete junction box, a critical junction point where multiple high-pressure flood drainage pipes intersected deep beneath the earth. He had personally operated the heavy machinery the following morning, pouring cubic yards of specialized, hydraulic-grade cement over the junction structure, permanently embedding her body within the water management infrastructure of upstate New York. He boasted that he had designed the spillway to withstand a 100-year flood event, knowing that the immense water pressure flowing through the pipes would actually serve to wash away any potential organic signatures, leaving her completely untraceable to the primitive forensic tools of the 20th century. The revelation sent an immediate shockwave through the New York State Police, who instantly realized that retrieving Rebecca's remains would require a massive, dangerous engineering operation to divert an entire regional watershed before specialized diving teams and forensic excavators could safely breach the subterranean junction box. As the news of the Plattsburgh confession broke across the national airwaves, the media coverage reached a level of unprecedented frenzy, with major networks launching special nightly investigative programs titled The Concrete Killer, mapping the infrastructure of death. The public paranoia was no longer localized to Boston. It had transformed into a national reckoning as citizens across the country began to realize that the very roads they drove on, the bridges they crossed, and the public utilities they relied upon had been built by a generation of workers who operated entirely in the shadows, completely unvetted by modern security protocols. The legal team representing the Vance family issued a formal press statement, emphasizing that the resolution of these cold cases was a testament to the unyielding power of multi-generational police work and modern genetic genealogy, proving that time is no longer a shield for monsters who believe they have outrun their sins. But as the engineering teams in upstate New York began the monumental task of diverting the freezing river waters to reach Rebecca's final resting place, the detectives back in the Boston War Room turned their attention to the final 2 items in the ammunition box, knowing that the clock was ticking down to the official start of the most historic serial murder trial in New England history. The logistical nightmare of diverting a regional watershed in upstate New York during the dead of winter became a monumental battle between human engineering and the unforgiving elements, a stark visual representation of the length to which the modern justice system would go to reclaim a stolen life. As heavy steel coffer dams were hammered into the frozen bed of the Saranac River system, diverting millions of gallons of rushing, icy water away from the concrete drainage network, a team of specialized subterranean recovery divers waited in insulated dry suits on the surface. They were preparing to descend into a dark, claustrophobic labyrinth of industrial pipes that had been sealed off from the world since May 1992, guided entirely by the cold, calculated blueprints provided by Arthur Pendleton. When the heavy hydraulic gates were finally dropped, stopping the roaring flow of water and leaving the subterranean junction box exposed for the first time in 34 years, the forensic team stepped into the dripping, echo-filled concrete tomb. There, deep within the structural core of the water management matrix, exactly where the contractor had specified, they located the skeletal remains of Rebecca Lowe, her wrists still bound by the degraded fibers of the canvas cargo strap, her story finally salvaged from the dark, rushing waters of time. With 4 definitive recoveries secured, the multi-jurisdictional task force inside the Boston War Room knew they were entering the final, most legally precarious phase of Operation Cold Horizon. The massive whiteboard that detailed Pendleton's life was now a crowded landscape of definitive convictions, but 2 items still sat on the velvet mats under the laboratory lights, their identities fiercely protected by the absolute silence of the past. The 5th trophy was a delicate, vintage silver locket, its surface heavily scratched and dented, containing a tiny, faded photograph of an elderly couple from the 1950s, an intimate family heirloom that had undoubtedly been torn from the neck of a victim during her final moments of terror. Unlike the previous items, which had been tracked using industrial serial numbers or localized missing persons reports tied to specific construction projects, this locket possessed no distinct manufacturing marks, forcing the digital analytics team to deploy advanced facial recognition software on the microscopic portrait contained within its silver frame. The digital enhancement team spent 72 continuous hours cleaning up the grain, contrast, and fading of the tiny photograph, uploading the restored images of the elderly couple into national genealogical databases, public census records, and historical archival networks across the Northeast. By late February 2026, the digital dragnet finally returned a significant hit. The couple in the photograph were identified as Thaddeus and Eleanor Vance, no relation to Elena Vance, residents of a small coastal town in Maine who had both passed away in the early 1970s. Following this specific genealogical bloodline forward through public records, investigators discovered that the couple had only one grandchild, a 24-year-old oceanography student named Cindy Vance, who had vanished from the historic waterfront district of Portland, Maine, in the late autumn of 1995. The local police files from Portland revealed a familiar, devastating narrative. Cynthia had left a waterfront laboratory at 10:30 p.m. on a foggy November night, carrying a box of research samples to her vehicle, and had completely dissolved into the coastal mist, leaving behind an investigation that had remained entirely frozen for over 3 decades. The geographic cross-reference was immediate and absolute. In November 1995, Arthur Pendleton's construction company had been hired as a primary subcontractor to repair the concrete seawalls, structural piers, and deep underwater foundations of the very shipping terminal where Cynthia Vance conducted her marine research. The proximity was chilling. His work crew operated on a strict night shift schedule to minimize disruption to the active commercial harbor, granting him complete, unquestioned access to the darkened, industrial waterfront during the exact hours Cynthia was walking to her car. For 31 years, the Portland detectives had operating under the assumption that Cynthia had accidentally fallen into the deep, turbulent waters of the harbor during the heavy fog, or that she had been targeted by a transient sailor who had immediately boarded a ship and left the country, completely missing the predator who was operating heavy equipment just a few hundred feet from her laboratory door. Inside the interrogation room, Detective Hayes and Special Agent Vance prepared for what they knew would be a grueling, high-stakes confrontation with a serial killer who was beginning to realize that every word he spoke was ensuring his permanent placement in the darkest chapters of American criminal history. Pendleton sat completely motionless, his face pale and sunken, his eyes staring blankly at the scarred metal surface of the table as if he could see the faces of the women he had stolen returning to claim their justice. Detective Hayes reached into his case file, pulling out the high-resolution photograph of the silver locket and sliding it directly into the center of Pendleton's field of vision, alongside a vibrant portrait of Cynthia Vance standing on the deck of a research vessel, her smile bright against the backdrop of the open ocean. Portland, Maine, November 1995, Arthur, Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative rumble that seemed to fill the sterile room with the cold gravity of the Atlantic. You were working the midnight shift on the pier seawalls. Cynthia Vance walked out into the fog and never came back. You took her locket. You kept her grandparents' faces hidden behind your workbench. It's time to tell us where she is, Arthur. The water didn't wash her away, and neither did you. Pendleton's fingers twitched against the coarse fabric of his orange jumpsuit, his breathing growing shallow as he stared at the small silver locket, the last remnants of his defensive armor beginning to shatter completely under the weight of the undeniable connection. A cold, detached smile played briefly at the corners of his mouth, a terrifying manifestation of the sociopathic pride he still felt for a crime he believed was entirely perfect. The ocean is a good place to hide things, he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated with a sickening level of nostalgia. People always assume the water does the work for you, that the tide takes everything out to sea. They don't understand that if you want something to stay down forever, you have to build it into the earth itself, right where the water meets the stone. He then proceeded to detail the logistics of the November 1995 abduction with a level of clinical, architectural precision that made the blood of the listening investigators run cold. He explained how he had used the heavy fog and the loud, rhythmic pounding of the industrial diesel pile drivers on the pier to mask his approach as Cynthia walked toward the isolated parking area reserved for research staff. Dressed in his full contractor's gear, he had stepped out from behind a massive stack of structural timber, using a heavy, pressurized air tool to simulate a mechanical malfunction on his equipment, politely asking her to hold a flashlight for a brief second while he adjusted a valve. The innocence of the interaction, combined with his age and professional appearance, completely neutralized her natural survival instincts, causing her to step close to the edge of the active construction zone without a single thought of danger. In a fraction of a second, Pendleton had turned violently, using his massive, calloused hands to overpower her, clamping a chemical-soaked rag over her mouth to silence her cries before dragging her unconscious body into the hidden interior of a massive wooden concrete form that was scheduled to be filled the following morning. With stomach-turning technical detail, Pendleton described how he had ended her life within the interior of the structural framework, removing her silver locket as a permanent token of his total control before preparing the space for the final construction phase. He had personally supervised the delivery of hundreds of tons of industrial-grade marine concrete the next day, pouring the heavy, water-resistant mixture directly into the seawall framework, permanently encasing Cynthia Vance's body within the massive, submerged foundation of the Portland shipping terminal. He had built his crime directly into the defensive barrier of the city, transforming a massive piece of public infrastructure into an invisible, underwater mausoleum that had withstood 31 years of relentless Atlantic tides and commercial shipping traffic. The confession sent an immediate shockwave through the Maine State Police and maritime authorities, who instantly realized that retrieving Cynthia's remains would require an unprecedented, highly complex engineering operation involving underwater salvage teams, deep-core concrete drilling rigs, and structural stabilization systems to prevent the active shipping pier from collapsing into the harbor. As the news of the Portland waterfront confession broke across the national media outlets, the public reaction transformed from simple fascination into a pervasive, terrifying fury that completely gripped the entire New England region. The local headlines screamed, "The Seawall Vault, Portland 1995 cold case solved," fueling a deep, viral paranoia that fundamentally altered how citizens viewed the massive concrete structures that line their coastal cities. Outside the Boston courthouse, the permanent encampment of media trucks, legal analysts, and true crime advocates grew to an unprecedented size, transforming the upcoming trial of Arthur Pendleton into one of the most significant legal events of the 21st century. Michael Vance stood prominently among the crowds, his presence a constant, sobering reminder of the long, agonizing journey that had begun with a single paper cup in a South Boston alleyway, his eyes fixed on the courthouse doors as the legal machinery of 5 states prepared to permanently erase the freedom of the monster who had spent a lifetime building a graveyard in the dark. The freezing, black waters of Portland Harbor churned violently against the massive concrete pillars of the shipping terminal, where a team of elite industrial divers and structural engineers fought against the brutal Atlantic tides. The extraction of Cindy Vance's remains was quickly turning into the most dangerous and complex maritime forensic operation in American history. Massive steel barges equipped with high-powered commercial cranes and underwater diamond wire cutting arrays were anchored off the pier, their roaring diesel engines shattering the midnight silence of the historic waterfront. Divers descended into the murky, zero-visibility depths of the harbor, working entirely by touch as they carefully attached stabilization collars to the submerged section of the seawall that Arthur Pendleton had poured in November 1995. When the underwater saws finally cut through the outer layers of the marine-grade concrete, breaching the structural void that had acted as a tomb for 31 years, a profound silence fell over the command barge. There, encased in the impenetrable, watertight core of the pier's foundation, the forensic team located the skeletal remains of the young oceanography student, her leather research notebook still partially preserved beneath the debris, its pages frozen in time like a tragic time capsule of a life stolen in the dark. The definitive recovery of Cynthia Vance marked the 5th successful resolution for Operation Cold Horizon, but inside the high-security war room in Boston, the atmosphere remained intensely focused and clinical. The calendar on the wall marked the spring of 2026, and the date for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Arthur Pendleton was rapidly approaching, leaving the task force with a narrowing window to crack the final, most elusive mystery hidden inside the dusty ammunition box. The 6th and final trophy sat under the glare of the laboratory lights, a heavy, vintage stainless steel wristwatch with a fractured crystal face and a deeply scratched backing. Unlike the previous items, which possessed distinct family engravings or recognizable heirloom aesthetics, this watch was a common mass-produced utility model from the early 1990s, offering no immediate digital or genealogical clues to the identity of its original owner. Detective Hayes and Special Agent Vance refused to let the final mystery remain unsolved, deploying a team of forensic microanalysts to examine the internal mechanisms of the damaged timepiece. Using high-powered digital magnification and laser scanning, technicians managed to isolate a microscopic series of alphanumeric codes etched into the interior casing, the unique mark of a localized jewelry repair shop. This tiny, invisible clue was run through historical business registries across New England, eventually tracing the repair mark back to a small, family-owned watchmaker that had operated in downtown Burlington, Vermont, during the mid-1990s. By cross-referencing the shop's surviving paper invoices with regional missing persons archives, a name finally emerged from the depths of forgotten history: Catherine Katie Reynolds, a 25-year-old environmental journalist who had vanished from a remote trailhead near the Green Mountains in the late summer of 1996. The geographic and chronological overlay matched with absolute, terrifying precision. In August 1996, Arthur Pendleton's construction company had been awarded a highly lucrative state contract to build a massive concrete retaining wall and scenic overlook platform along a treacherous stretch of Route 100, located less than a half-mile from the rugged mountain trail where Katie Reynolds was last seen. Katie was an investigative reporter for a regional newspaper, a fiercely independent young woman who was working on a high-profile exposé regarding the environmental impact of rapid mountain development. Her vehicle had been found parked neatly at the trailhead entrance, her hiking gear untouched in the trunk, but her investigative notes, her camera, and her utility wristwatch were completely missing, leaving behind a cold case that had paralyzed the rural Vermont community for exactly 30 years. Inside the sterile, windowless interrogation room, the psychological landscape had reached a state of terminal velocity. Arthur Pendleton sat heavily in the metal chair, his face a hollow, gray mask of exhaustion, his breathing shallow and rattling as the sheer weight of 5 confirmed homicides completely crushed his remaining sociopathic defenses. Special Agent Vance didn't waste a single second, sliding the high-resolution photograph of the fractured stainless steel watch directly into the center of his view, alongside a vibrant portrait of Katie Reynolds holding a vintage camera, her eyes bright with professional determination. Burlington, Vermont, August 1996. Arthur, Agent Vance said, her voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper that vibrated with absolute certainty. You were pouring the concrete overlook platform on Route 100. Katie Reynolds went into the woods and never came back out. You took her watch. You broke the crystal face when you dragged her out of the shadows. Tell us where she is, Arthur. Let us finish the story. Pendleton's bloodshot eyes locked onto the photograph of the fractured watch, his liver-spotted hands trembling violently against the surface of the metal table as a low, dry sob finally escaped his throat, the first sound of genuine defeat he had uttered since his arrest. The illusion of his omnipotence had completely shattered. The modern justice system had systematically dismantled his 30-year fortress of secrecy piece by piece, using his own carefully preserved trophies as the instruments of his execution. She was looking for things she shouldn't have been looking for, Pendleton muttered, his voice a gravelly, hollow rasp that filled the suffocating silence of the room. She was snooping around the construction equipment after the crews had left for the night, taking photographs of the runoff channels, completely oblivious to the fact that the real danger on that mountain wasn't the machinery, it was me. With chilling, clinical precision, Pendleton detailed the final hours of Katie Reynolds' life, explaining how he had used the isolation of the mountain trailhead to ambush her as she returned to her vehicle at dusk. Dressed in his full contractor's uniform, he had stepped out from the dense treeline, holding a heavy industrial blueprints container, claiming he was conducting a routine nighttime survey of the terrain boundaries to ensure the safety of the hiking path. The professional facade had completely disarmed Katie's journalistic skepticism for a fraction of a second, causing her to lower her guard and step closer to the edge of the unpaved shoulder to look at the map documents. In that single, fleeting moment of distraction, Pendleton had struck with terrifying violence, using his immense strength to tackle her to the ground, her wrist slamming violently against the gravel road, shattering the crystal face of her utility watch as he forced her into the rear of his commercial van. He confessed that he had taken her watch as a final, absolute monument to his control, keeping it hidden behind his basement workbench alongside the other markers of his hidden history. He had ended her life within an hour of the abduction, using a heavy piece of electrical wire, before utilizing his authority as the site manager to bury her deep within the one place he knew would never be disturbed by future development. With stomach-turning technical detail, Pendleton explained that he had placed Katie's body directly into the negative space beneath the massive, reinforced concrete foundation of the scenic overlook platform itself, personally operating the heavy concrete mixing trucks the following morning to seal her within thousands of tons of stone and steel. He had built his crime directly into the very monument designed to celebrate the natural beauty of the Vermont landscape, transforming a popular tourist destination into a permanent, hidden tomb that had stood entirely undetected for 3 long decades. The public broadcast of the Burlington Mountain confession triggered a massive wave of profound horror and outrage across the entire state of Vermont, as thousands of citizens realized they had stood on that very scenic platform, looking out over the beautiful autumn foliage, completely unaware of the darkness buried directly beneath their feet. Heavy demolition equipment and forensic excavation units were immediately dispatched to the mountain highway under a heavy state police escort, transforming the picturesque overlook into a high-stakes, industrial recovery zone. The Boston 1994 cold case solved had officially culminated in the exposure of an unprecedented, multi-state infrastructure killer, proving to the entire nation that no matter how deep a secret is buried beneath the concrete, the relentless march of modern science and the unyielding determination of dedicated investigators will eventually shatter the stone and bring the truth into the light.